Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections, my Black and Beautiful family. I am here today with a great friend of mine, and I'm going to go in and introduce him to you. But I just want to say thank you for joining us again. We are here to discuss, what's happening in the world, what's going on as it pertains to diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging. So many terms to identify, but today's episode is called White Allyship. Does that exist? And who better to answer this question than someone who identifies as white, right? But in particular, someone who is a white male. I think that's very important too for this lens tonight. So thank you for joining us. I have a special guest by the name of Peter Osborne. Peter Osborne, I met he was a colleague at a former institution that I worked at, and we kind of just connected on this professional level, and that has blossomed into a friendship. So Peter, why don't you introduce yourself to our Black and Beautiful family?
I am so honored to be here, and I'm so honored that you would ask me to be here. And as you said, I'm Peter Osborne. I live and work and play in the great state of Maine and the Great White North. As Charlene said, I work at a small college in Maine where we used to be colleagues. And my work revolves around career development and supporting students in their career exploration and launching careers and all of the various forms and formats that looks like for different young adults. It's exciting and challenging and sometimes frustrating work. Outside of work, which is where I spend most of my time in life, is outside of work.
Thank God.
I read a lot, I cook a lot, I spend a lot of time outdoors. I enjoy trivia and nonfiction. So
Nice.
that's a little bit about me.
And you're an actor, right?
I am an actor, yes. How could I forget?
You always forget that.
It's a relatively new part of my life. Well, it's a relatively renewed part of my life. When I was younger in high school, I did a lot of theater, and just in the past 2 or 3 years kind of rekindled my spark for community theater, and never quite realized how much a creative outlet was missing from my life. So it's been challenging in COVID times, as has been literally everything in life. But it's also been a little bit of a bright beacon too.
Yes, I love it. I loved all my drama courses when I was in college. I took theater as like a minor, but I never told anyone because I love theater. I love acting too. My voice, everybody's like, you're so loud, but it's like I learned to get my voice to carry exactly in an auditorium. So it's just like, you guys just don't understand.
You don't get it. You're not a theater kid.
Exactly. So when you told me you were going back into theater and I had left Maine at that point, but I would have definitely been at your place. So congrats to you for sparking that, internal interest to have an outlet, that creative outlet. I think that's very important for our audience to understand as well, that you are in your thoughts, your ideas, your creativity is not just your work and your title. It's more than that. It's what you do outside of that, how you take up space in your community, and how you utilize your own inner creativity to give back to the world. So I think that's super dope. So thanks for sharing and me putting you on blast. I know you have like all these letters behind your name too. So like, can you talk to us a little bit about your credentials, your creds?
Sure. Well, I studied to be a teacher. Actually, I trained as a high school teacher. Mm-hmm. That was my first passion. So I went to college to study secondary education, then went on to graduate school and earned a master's in adult and higher education, and actually really sparked an interest in in that program in transformative education and liberatory education, kind of in the line of Paulo Freire and similar types of thinkers. I have done some doctoral work in ed policy, organization, and leadership with a focus on equity and diversity in education. Currently on a leave of absence, evaluating if that's really a long-term goal of mine.
Right.
But regardless of whether or not I continue in that program, have really enjoyed the opportunity to engage with a diverse group of educators around issues of diversity and equity that affect all levels of and all settings of the educational system in the United States and in the world. And I probably should just take this off my LinkedIn, but my little blurb at the end of my name, CCSP, just means Certified Career Services Provider, which is
Right.
a professional credential that I earned with the National Career Development Association a couple of years ago.
Why would you take that off? That's like, I love that CCSP, because I feel like if you're going to be working in the career center, right? I don't think people value, especially students, you know how we have to like convince them to go to the career center. It's like people who work in the art of career services, whether it be at a higher education institution or an independent organization or an organization that's contracted by the government, like some type of social policy that was passed to provide, career services to a community, like that's a skill.
Mhm.
It's legit a skill. It's not
Yeah.
something that you could just be like, oh, I'm going to be a career services provider today. No, like you legit have to learn. You have to learn how to provide those types of services, because it's a multifaceted, and you have to have a multi-pronged approach in order to really understand someone's personal career trajectory, while also understanding trends in industries and what that looks like, what credentials look like for those industries.
And how does career development for the 21, 22-year old, or even the 17 or 18-year-old fit into the larger trends of work? And I know this isn't the focus of what we're talking about today, but things like the Great Resignation, and I mean, we've seen this incredible resurgence of labor movements and union organizing and all kinds of things that I hope are changing the face of work for all of us in it, but also those folks who've yet to enter that world.
I agree. The landscape is definitely being challenged right now. We are antagonizing organizations that are strictly performative and have harmful environments. People want to work where they're morally aligned with the organization. And as we can see, some of these organizations lack a moral compass, which takes me into our conversation for today.
Yeah.
Now, white allyship, right?
Yeah.
Before we talk about white allyship, I want to ask you a question as an icebreaker.
Sure.
And my question to you is, when you think of the term, which I always make this a prerequisite because George Floyd is not a martyr, but I'm using it as an example of where we are nationally. So when I say post George Floyd as a term, what does that mean to you in this moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the murder of George Floyd and the way that it was captured and spread about on social media and in the mainstream media took the problem of police brutality, but not just police brutality, but like state-sponsored murder. And it served it to us, and by us, I mean white America, on a silver platter and said, you can't ignore this any longer.
Mm-hmm.
Here it is. You can't ignore it. This is happening. But here's the first time that we've got, not the first time, here's an incredibly blatant example
right.
that you can't ignore. And so the murder of George Floyd was not the first time that a Black person was murdered by police, obviously, but I think it was an incredibly pivotal moment where people could no longer ignore what was happening. And I think it raised it to a level of discourse that, I mean, really forced white people to pick a side. Where are you? What do you believe in? What are your
There
values?
is a line in the sand right now.
Yeah.
There's a huge dark line. It's a black line. It's thick, thick, thick. It's in the sand, and it's saying, which side are you on? And you know what? That's not just for white folks, right? Because anti-Blackness is real. And so that's for anyone who, some people legit believe like, oh, well, he was a criminal. He should have been murdered. As if all criminals deserve to be murdered. It's ridiculousness, right? So that line in the sand, I like that you brought up that analogy. It is drawn, and now we get to see what people support and what they don't support.
Yeah, and your point of like people making a point that he was a criminal or committed a crime to justify his murder, like, let's just, we don't need to play devil's advocate, but let's imagine for a moment that that's true and he did commit a crime. Okay, in this country, police don't have the right to execute people for committing any crime. That's not how it's supposed to work here. So
you are innocent until proven guilty in the court of law.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So,
and a police officer is not a lawyer and not a judge, not a jury. They legit make a report, and that report gets used for, to develop charges, and those charges then go on to the appropriate parties to carry it out. The police officers are literally frontline workers in that chain. So for a frontline worker to take it upon themselves to be judge and jury, this is a real problem.
Well, and I think we juxtapose that to, over the past couple of years, we've had a number of these like cases of young white men who were afflicted with this affluenza. They're too wealthy for their own good that they're out of touch with reality. And they commit a crime, they, commit a sexual assault or they murder somebody. And the narrative becomes, well, this person did all of these good things in their life up to this point. This one mistake shouldn't define them and shouldn't ruin their lives. So it's like, it's a stark, and I can't explain it. It's unexplainable, except for white supremacy, that the media and the public discourse would treat similar situations so starkly different.
Right? So, I mean, they're like night and day.
Yeah.
A young white man commits a crime, murders people. Oh, he is just a troubled youth.
Right.
A young black or brown body, does the same crime. He's a deviant, a menace to society, an intelligent buffoon, whatever all these different narratives.
Right.
And, we can get into that conversation and we could stay there all day, but I want to make sure that we move into the next part. And I wanted to share, so timely that I'm asking you this George Floyd question, right? Because 2 days ago in Minneapolis, yes, where Breonna Taylor was murdered as well, a 22-year-old by the name of Amir Locke was killed by police who entered his home and shot him to death. Now, they're reporting that the police had executed a search warrant and he was not named in it. So they did a no-knock warrant, once again, in Minneapolis. I want to make this very clear that in Minneapolis, we were told post Breonna Taylor, and I use those terms just as a way to describe the time that we're in, not to make these people martyrs or harm their families or anything. My heart goes out to their families, their loved ones, and even us who suffer from the trauma of what happened to these people. But in Minneapolis, we were told by government officials that this no-knock warrant is now illegal in that area, right? So they entered in without knocking and claimed it was because he had a gun, the young man, which he legally owned, was the reason why they killed him. Now, we all know that if the police went and ran up in a farmer's, and I'm not saying that all farmers are white, but a white farmer's home, who has 5 shotguns on the mantle, and he grabbed the shotgun and they ran up in his house with no knock, right? With a warrant, and they didn't knock, they burst his door down. He's going to grab his shotgun, and somebody's getting hurt that night. Why? Because you are invading my home. At this point, it's self-defense. Why is this okay for, and this is a rhetorical question, like we said with the media and how the white supremacy lens gives this stark difference of the same things happening. Why is it that this lens continues to perpetuate itself in this manner where people then get complacent and say, oh, yeah, you know what? You're right. That white man didn't deserve to die, but that young Black man did, or that young brown man did, or those Asian people did, right? Like, it's just sickening. So anyway, I don't know if you have some words. I get triggered by this. You know, you're seeing me live in action right now. I said that I want this platform to be a professional platform with an authentic twist. And what you guys are seeing is a Black woman seriously being triggered by this. Waking up in the morning and having to look through your social media and see another person that looks like you. I have little Black cousins. I have Black brothers. I have Black uncles. I have Black fathers. I like seeing another person that could be one of my family members, God forbid, being murdered at the hands of police officers who refuse to take direct orders to change their lens. At this point, I personally see the police officers as criminals. You went against your orders. You blatantly targeted a person of color, which proves your intent in that moment. I mean, there is no other explanation. Right. So you guys are seeing a real live trigger right now, and it's disgusting and it's deplorable. And being a person of color in America is a real deal. And to anyone out there who wants to justify the actions of police officers in this country who choose to do the complete opposite of what society is asking them for, if you agree and align with that, you really need to take a look at yourself, because clearly, and I know this is the worst thing you could do, but clearly you have a white supremacy lens and you are a racist, period. That line is drawn.
We live in an authoritarian white nationalist police state. Is it too strong to say that here? I'm gonna go on record and say that.
Listen, I want you to be as authentic as possible, right? Because not only are we living in this, but we're also professionals. We also have our own opinions. We are human beings navigating this space. And your lens in this moment on your off time is your personal lens. So I do want to make a disclaimer that all the people who are on my platform as guests, they're here to share insight into the way that they navigate the world. These are not ways to hold their opinions against them. We are having intellectual conversations, and sometimes some uncomfortable things come out. So I champion that. You are going to be authentic and straightforward in this moment. No, I don't believe that that's harsh, but I do want to put that disclaimer out there.
And let me go on record. My opinions as expressed here can be tied to any aspect of my life, professional or not. I hold up authenticity as a real. So, that's what I said.
Emoji.
That's what I said. You know?
All right, so finish your thought.
Well, I think that I think, and this so ties into, I think, the rest of our conversation as it will unfold around white allyship and performative allyship. You know, we have heard over the past almost 2 years now, so many statements so many promises, so many quote unquote plans to address both the specific issue of state-sponsored murder and police brutality toward Black Americans, that and for a lot of the white officials and white people of power who are making those statements, it's really like an abstract concept. A lot of white people, even the idea of Black Lives Matter is an abstract concept.
That is true.
And I think like reform or action, or people want to believe that they're being deliberate and being thoughtful about how to address these issues, but in reality there's no sense of urgency to stop the fact that real people are dying at the hands of the government through the police. And if you want to act, because we are spending years exploring and planning and discussing and dialoguing. And we know what needs to happen. Black people need to stop being killed by the police.
Yep.
Period. So stop.
Right. And we don't need that through like community policing or all these other different terms. Like Joe Biden legit just, this is, once again, I'm going to try not to be sugar because we're on an intellectual platform. So I'm going to try to chill out, but I want to show you guys. Joe Biden legit just had a press conference that he's throwing $200 million, right, to assessing community policing and changing the structure of police. Stop throwing money at it.
Right.
Because it's not working. Pass legislation. Why is it still okay for Black folks to be lynched in this country while you throw $200 million and lie to us at every given turn about what it is that you're going to do? We need political power. We need legislation passed to protect communities of people of color in this country, period. But we need to reassess policy. I don't see, throw $200 million at that to get a national consortium of scholars, of activists, of people who are dedicated to understanding how legislation and policy works. Put $200 million to a consortium of people and let them, completely rip apart all of our legislation as it pertains to people of color in this country and provide feedback on how to address the gaps and make sure that we are reducing harm.
Yep.
That's how you do it. You don't do it by sending $200 million to do community policing. Black folk don't need community policing. We need the police to see us as human beings, period.
Accountability, right? There's been so much legislation proposed that's really held up, both not just in Congress, but also in state legislatures. I know there have been some pieces of legislation here in Maine focused on things like ending qualified immunity, right? So actually allowing police officers to be held accountable for their actions, which, how is that not common sense reform? To end something like qualified immunity, right? It doesn't. That
doesn't even sound that hard, right?
It doesn't. That's just one thing, and so we're going to spend $200 million, which, in the grand scope of a multi-trillion-dollar federal budget, is a drop in the bucket. A literal drop.
Thank you for saying that.
But we're going to spend $200 million investigating the issue. We've already got legislation that's held up in Congress by Democrats and Republicans.
Thank you.
To actually address this issue. It's self-serving and it's purely performative.
I agree. All right, let's get into allyship.
Let's do it.
Guys,
we're all warmed up juicy. Now. We're all warmed up.
That was seriously juicy, right? Like, you guys just seen history in the making. You seen a Black woman and a white man rip the government apart. No, but literally just with the means of, or with the end goal of ensuring that people just have a fair chance in this country, that justice really plays out fairly and equitably. That's it. It's not to say that our legislators are mean or bad, or we're not speaking negatively on them. We know that there are some really great politicians out there who are trying to do the good work. But for those of them who are corrupt, we're talking to you, period. All right, so let's go into allyship. So I want to give the definition of allyship, and excuse me for looking to the side. I usually have like my definitions and stuff right in front of me, but I have them on the side today because I want to make sure that we are in this gallery view so people can see, how we're interacting. What is allyship? So according to Forbes, right, it's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. So when we look at allyship, you have to take a lens that you are in a privileged position in that moment, and your allyship is contingent upon your relationship with people who are historically ignored, marginalized, or groups of, who are historically ignored or marginalized. And these groups of people, right, you're trying to build trust, you're trying to build relationships, and you're consistent, and you hold yourself accountable with them. That's what allyship means. So, another definition for allyship that we have is an active, consistent, and lifelong practice of unlearning and relearning in which the person in the position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with those who come from historically marginalized groups. Now, these two definitions, to me, hit it on the nail when it comes to the call to action for allyship from white folks, right? Or the call to action for allyship for people, straight folks who support the LGBTQ plus movement. Just giving examples of how you stand in solidarity with these marginalized groups. And so how do you interpret allyship, Peter? Like, as I'm going through the definitions, as we get heated up, we're thinking about, what it looks like to empower white folks to really be solid allies. What does that look like for you? How do you interpret it?
Well, I think I'm with you that I think those are really solid definitions. And I especially identify with the definition around the process of unlearning and relearning, because I think allyship is an action and not a state. It's a verb, not a noun. Mm-hmm. It's something you do, and it's not necessarily something that you are, in my mind.
Yes.
And also, I personally don't believe that white people get to label themselves as allies. I don't believe that. That's not a title or an honorific that, as a white person, as a white cisgender heterosexual male in the United States, I don't have the right to label myself an ally of anything. Okay. Right. That's my opinion. I also believe that allyship, the act of striving to allyship, right? I can't label myself an ally, but I can say I commit to striving to allyship as an active process. Mm-hmm. And for me, and I think for most white people who have grown up, white people in the United States who have grown up and who have been indoctrinated through schooling, through the media, through organizations and corporations and advertising. I mean, we've been indoctrinated into this system of white supremacy and this myth of meritocracy that, people earn their place in this society based on their own merits and their own good work. Right. The first step is you have to examine those beliefs in yourself as a person with majoritized identities. You have to say first, okay, these things, you have to come to a realization that these things are not true. Right. They never have been true. They never will be true. But what are the systems that led you to believe them and to and to ingrain them into the way that you see the world, right? So that I think is the process of unlearning.
Yes.
And inherent to that is like figuring out, you have to understand the history of how did these things come to be, right?
Absolutely. I think that's where we're missing the gap there. We're missing it. Not to cut you off, but just to get involved in what you're saying, because I agree with you 100%. I feel as we're moving into this more intellectual space of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, this more taking a theoretical framework and putting into practice space, I'm finding that there's a gap with white folks about the foundations of this country and where this information comes from.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where the gap is. If we're speaking directly about white folks, right? There's also a gap with people of color and people who come from historically ignored communities who are living in the trauma and just know that these things feel wrong, but they also don't know where this comes from, where the ideology comes from. So shameless plug, in Policing Blackness, episode 1, I went over Willie Lynch, Letter to a Slave, and I showed you guys where the global slave trade was the lens for white supremacy and whiteness in this country. I give you quotes, there's information. Please go check it out, because I feel like we all need to know the historical context of the global slave trade and how that translated into the Atlantic slave trade and how that translated into when the slave trade was eradicated globally, but America closed its borders and started to trade internally. We need to know this. And all of those systems and structures that were created then are what we are engaging in now.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of white people in the United States, there are two pivotal moments in United States history when racism ended. The end of the Civil War and Martin Luther King Jr., the Civil Rights Movement.
Oh, right? You're missing one more.
Barack
Obama became president.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because now we live in a post-racial society. Yes! Oh, I forgot. Yeah.
Remember that?
But folks seem to miss things like the 13th Amendment, which actually legalized slavery in prisons and set us on the path of the prison industrial complex,
who are now president supported.
Right. Yes.
Anyway,
that has that's ongoing. That's ongoing right now.
Yes.
And I think there are also people, if we look at the racial wealth gap, right? I think people, because they only conceptualize those pivotal moments in US history, to them, the logical conclusion is that there's a racial wealth gap because white people work harder and Black people don't. So that's the reason
racial
for the gap.
Stereotype of laziness.
But we forget things like redlining, which wasn't that long ago.
It's still
actually
happening.
Still happens,
yes.
just not federally, officially as a federal practice.
But it does happen locally, and
our
states are actually engaging in it. I live in the capital region of New York, and they are districting this area, which is gerrymandering, which is literally illegal, and they're doing it right under everyone's noses. And for those of you who don't understand what redlining is, another term that's used, it's called residential segregation. And in that residential segregation, resources are pulled from those communities and placed into white communities. So when you say that someone's not working, or someone's not working as hard, or white folks are more equipped than Black folks, what you're doing is you're agreeing with resources being stripped from low income people of color communities and placed into white communities where white folks are afforded more opportunity and access. And because of that, it then trickles into the wealth gap, where you have more opportunity to work, you have more opportunities to gain useful employment, your salaries are higher, you're able to sell your homes for better, you're able to get loans easier. And there's a cadre of examples to show how the white experience in America is afforded by residential segregation in this country and robbing people of color from their opportunity to thrive in America. Do your research. Do your research.
We are not, easy to find.
Don't take our words for it.
Right.
Go and do your own research.
And I want people to go and look up the GI Bill following World War II also, because this was just a couple of generations ago.
And right? Those people are still alive.
Where they are. And what happened was in World War II, you know, there were so many, both white and black and lots of other Americans of different racial identities went and fought on the front lines of World War II for this country. After World War II, the GI Bill was established to do a number of things for veterans, but two of the primary ones that I think are tied specifically to the racial wealth gap are the GI Bill continues to provide really generous financial assistance for education and government-backed loans for home purchases.
With low interest.
With low interest.
0 to none, basically.
And both of those things still exist, but immediately after World War II, Black veterans were not allowed to take advantage of either of those programs. So they weren't able to purchase homes, which in this country is the number one source of wealth for people, of intergenerational wealth for people, no less. And they weren't able to access a college education, which is another huge source of being able to build careers, build intergenerational wealth. Because then you can kind of see the cascading effects of one generation not going on to get an education makes it harder for the next generation to get an education, and so on and so forth. So, you know, I think those are just a couple of specific examples of what white people who aim to be committed to allyship need to understand the history of this country.
Yes, and need to understand that we're saying history as a way to explain examples of what's happening now, not history that it stopped.
That's right.
It's still happening right now, today, right at this very moment, when you're watching this, when you pause it, when you put it back, when you press play again, when you rewind it, it's still going on. It's still happening.
Origins. Thank you for that clarification, because what I really should be saying is the origins of systemic problems that have contributed to gaps like this, but as well as state-sponsored murder of Black folks.
There's a cadre of things. We have named a few. Obviously, criminal justice reform needs to happen. Residential segregation, addressing the wealth gap, education, access, resources. These are things that we are, as diversity, equity, and inclusion, justice and belonging individuals who are dedicated, we are dedicated to addressing this in any way that we can. And so this platform, Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections, we want to provide you with a perspective of what the workplace looks like, but then give you some origins or some historical context on how those systems are able to be perpetuated and upheld, because we're not addressing legislation, we're not addressing policy, we're not addressing the federal and state leveled what's the word I'm looking for, ability to continue to do these things, right? So that takes me to performative allyship. And so given this term's recent inception, right? I say this because a lot of buzzwords in DEI, like, you know, like allyship, diversity, equity, and inclusion, like these are just buzzwords that people are using right now. Like, correct me if I'm wrong. Do you feel that way too?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the term has a recent inception, performative allyship versus authentic allyship. So I think it's worth the discussion. So according to Penn State law, in an article titled, "How do you diminish effective how do you distinguish effective allyship from performative allyship? The definition was given that performative allyship is when someone from a non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that is not helpful. So this is known as performative wokeness, right? Mm-hmm. And so performative allyship is based on the idea of self-gratification and does not look at your responsibility within a community, and it is disingenuous. So I want to elaborate, give you some time to elaborate on your initial statement that white folks don't get to say that they're allies, right? Mm-hmm. Like you don't get to that. You said that was your opinion. I agree with you. Based on this definition, that's what they're saying. You don't get to say that you're an ally just because your mouth is saying so. Right. It's an action, right? Yeah. And it can be disingenuous and not helpful. So talk to me a little bit about performative allyship, and perhaps maybe give us an example of what that looks like from your lens.
Yeah. So I think performative allyship can be characterized as what it's not, right? It's not including those important components of allyship that we talked about earlier, the process of people unlearning and relearning things, unlearning and relearning how they move within this society and their role in racialized systems. And it's also not rooted in building relationships of trust and commitment. You can't have true allyship. So I would say that anything outside of that is performative allyship. If we cast a wide net here, right? But I think you brought up a really important point, Charlene, that it's self-aggrandizing, it's self-centering. Performative allyship, I think, my opinion is that it's done for the purpose of getting attention for yourself. I have too many examples to talk about. So I'm going to give a couple of different ones. I think in the summer of 2020, we saw a lot of things after George Floyd's murder, of course, of a lot of white people for the first time making statements around Black Lives Matter or things like that, and primarily on social media. So right. I had a friend of mine who her white male identifying conservative father had posted something on Facebook about Black Lives Matter for the first time, and she was very proud of him. But that struck up a dialogue between she and I about the nature of performative allyship, specifically. And ultimately it was, I think ultimately she understood that was performative, but I think the idea was, well, it's better than nothing and staying silent. And I think that's how a lot of people justify performative allyship. They don't want to do the work of actual allyship, so they settle for doing something that I guess is technically better than nothing. But I'm not convinced that it's better than nothing because it's self-centering. So that's one example.
Also extremely, see, this type of stuff would make me want to cuss. It's extreme. Thank God this is a Christian platform, so we're not cussing on this platform. But it definitely makes me want to, because, it's better than nothing. That statement is extremely triggering to my ears, because as a woman of color, I don't have the option to be like, that's better than nothing.
Right.
When my life is on the line.
Yeah.
And that's a very great example of what that performative allyship looks like, right? Because she cared nothing about the plight of what she was supposed to be in solidarity with. Yeah. She just cared that no one saw her as the opposite.
Yeah. And I think
or her dad.
For some people, things like that can be the starting point to actual acts of allyship.
Elaborate for me.
Well, it might be a first a first kind of public statement of what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be like a testing of the waters, kind
Mm-hmm.
of. But that doesn't make it not performative. That particular act, it's still performative. And, I guess you could justify it as, well, I'm just starting to understand and learn and unlearn and all of that. But it can't be the end all be all. It just can't be. And I think for so many people, that's it. I mean, that's their allyship, is making public statements on Facebook about Black Lives Matter.
So we're gonna pivot, right? Because we're coming up on the hour, and I like to stay within the hour because I don't want to throw so much at people.
Yeah.
So I want to pivot a little bit, and we're gonna go into this last piece, and then we're gonna close out, if that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned something just now that was very profound to me, that someone placing a statement on their personal social media is them testing the waters, right? And so someone might say, well, what waters are they testing, right? And so I want to be very explicit in this moment that along with a white person's thoughts of allyship, there are also their thoughts of affinity to their whiteness.
White solidarity.
Okay. And that white solidarity is the unlearning that I think you're talking about, Peter, right? Because that white solidarity is rooted in a white supremacy lens.
Sure is.
And so that juxtapose of, well, this is what I've been taught and indoctrinated in, and I'm supposed to be like power to the people with my white folks. But if I'm saying this, now I'm looking like I'm some sort of traitor. Yeah. And like, I don't know how to feel. So that brings me into my next question. I wanted you to talk about this because I thought this was really dope of you and a group of people. And this is something that I bring into organizations when I do like trainings and I provide feedback on employee resource groups. The White Educators Against Racism group. I don't know what you called your group specifically. I can't remember the acronym, but you guys created a white affinity space to do what exactly? Because I know that's going to sound triggering to some people, but talk to us about that because I think this is really powerful.
Yeah. And in full disclosure, because I don't want to present myself as something as I'm not, that group has ceased to exist, unfortunately.
At least you tried it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it because I think it's important.
Yeah, it was a group of some white folks I knew, and we called ourselves the Antiracist Education and Action group. That was our kind of moniker for ourselves. And we would get together on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, and usually read and discuss. And also, because we all kind of worked in very different spaces and we had different ways that we wanted to practice anti-racism, but we would come together, read something, discuss it that really was meant to challenge our conception of race in society. And we were trying to also explore different voices that we hadn't exposed ourselves to in the past, and process those things together, but also set some individual goals for what we were going to be actually doing. So it was about learning, but it was also about trying to actually take action. I think, we came together out of a common goal, a common set of goals, that over time, I don't know that we were committed enough as a group, because we didn't stick together. It did lead to a lot of conversations about what the group was and what the group wasn't. And we had a lot of conversations early on about what our norms and expectations of one another were going to be. And, essentially we said, we're not here to coddle one another. We're not here to soothe your hurt feelings.
Or white guilt. That's called white
Yeah,
guilt.
we're not here to incubate your white guilt either. This is not a space for you to process your white guilt. That's not what this is. This is a place of accountability. This is a place where we're going to push one another. And for the time that we were together, I think we did do that. And I'm disappointed that it hasn't stayed together.
I can see your disappointment, but I will say that you and another colleague of mine, you both white males who have privilege, cisgendered, heterosexual males who have privilege, told me that they were a part of these types of groups where white folks was working out white folks stuff. And to be honest with you, I love it. Why? Because white folks have to do those things together. We have seen over and over again that when we are in diverse, and it doesn't even have to be diverse. It could be you're in a predominantly white space, but there's a couple of people of color, or a couple of people in the room who identify as not as white. And you find that in the training or in that activity, when it's time to deconstruct whiteness or deconstruct privilege or deconstruct the lens of white supremacy, white folks shut down in those moments, right? And there's complete silence. Thoughts, emotions, all these things are going on in your mind, in their minds, but there's complete silence. There's no, the activity kind of breaks down. And I know that that's a feedback that we've gotten. And I've always said that's because white folks need to be in the room with other white folks talking about this stuff, right? It can't be in front of people of color because now I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to expose myself. There's all these different, well, what about my solidarity? What about my family? Oh, I actually have engaged in this behavior before. I'm a racist. The worst thing you could ever do is tell a white person they're racist. That's all. I learned that. The worst thing you can do is call a white person a racist because the first thing they're going to do is rebuttal it. And their rebuttal is usually, well, I have friends of color. Right. or my child, or my, somebody's interracial in my family. And that's not the point, right? So I always, when I go into organizations, I always say, as we go through trainings and as we get we're building out that plan of what DEI looks like in everyday operations, the end goal has to be that there is a white-centered employee resources group where white folks are getting together talking about that accountability piece.
And I think
not an incubator for white guilt, like you said, but holding each other accountable for processing what they're learning, the deconstruction and the reconstruction, processing that together in that type of solidarity, so that when they go out now and they're interacting with someone like me, this type of dialogue is not triggering for them. They're able to articulate how they once saw and the process in which they got to this reconstruction.
And I think you really have to have a group of people to not letting it become an incubator for white guilt, because it can happen very quickly.
Right.
And I think the only people who I have ever, and I'll be honest with you, I have not talked about this group with a lot of other white people, because even people who consider themselves really educated and committed to anti-racism are like, that doesn't seem right to me that it's an exclusive group of white people doing. And my response is, anytime you get together a group of white people with maybe a small number of folks of color in that room, and we start talking about real issues, we instinctually fall on our friends or colleagues of color to educate us.
Right.
And we're overburdening them for our benefit. It's just another form of cultural taxation.
Listen, and it's tiring. Okay.
We can't help it. We can't help it. And we think that we're doing it because we want to give our friends and colleagues of color a voice. And we think that we're doing them a favor by giving them an opportunity to educate us, but it continues just to be a burden. And as white people, we cannot help it.
I think that my response to those people who would say, well, it feels like it's just wrong that all white people are coming together. You know what's wrong? What you're seeing, they're incapable of seeing what the difference is. Right. What's wrong is a group of white people coming together making decisions for a group of people of color. That's what's wrong.
Yeah.
What's wrong is a group of white people coming together and creating policies that are harmful for a group of people who come from historically marginalized communities. That is what's wrong. But white people coming together to work through their whiteness, oh no, that's very good. Mm-hmm. That is very good.
Yeah. Right.
That I find that kudos to you for taking that extra step and really doing the internal work that's required. Because I think as a general consensus, understanding equity in this country, understanding inclusion and what diversity is encompassed of, it's like, we know that this is really not a people of color problem.
Right. Exactly.
This is not a historically marginalized community problem.
That's right.
Historically ignored community problem. White folks need to step up to the plate.
Right. We created these racialized structures. And
you up at bat. You are up at bat right now.
I believe that under the leadership of folks of color, it's our responsibility to do the heavy lift of dismantling them.
I agree. And I feel like if that person of color wants to be the leader in that arena, it's not just, I 100% agree with you, but it's not exclusive to the person of color being the one doing most of the work, right?
Yeah.
And not most of the work, but being in that leadership role, because there are white folks who are capable of being in that leadership role, as long as they're not trying to capitalize on the lived experiences of people of color, right? Because not every person of color is equipped to do this work and be a leader in that space.
And let me just
make sure we're choosing the right candidates to do this job.
And thank you for that. And I should provide clarity on what I meant by leadership of people of color. Just that I think we need to defer to people of color to call the shots on what a more equitable structure is going to look like.
Representation matters, baby.
Yeah.
If you are creating systems, structures, policies, procedures, and they are affecting a cadre of intersecting identities, you must have those intersecting identities at the table with you.
Yeah.
You need that feedback.
Yeah.
Period.
Right.
Anyway, listen, Peter, I just really am so happy that you came on this platform and you are willing to be with me and my Black and beautiful family talking about what allyship looks like. And I think that we learned a couple of things, but one of the things we did learn is that in practice, an ally in solidarity is able to have an intellectual, morally focused conversation about what's happening in this country, validating the experiences of people while also sharing their own lens and how they view the world, and utilizing their power, their privilege, and how they take up space in a positive way to help people move things forward. And I hope that we were able to model that today as the example of what it looks like in action, in practice, right? Because you go back to your workspace and you pump this into your workspace. I go back to my workspace and I pump this into my workspace. And that's the goal of Black and Beautiful Chit Chat Connections, guys. We want you guys to go into your workspaces and be empowered to have these types of conversations, to dig up the history behind this stuff, to analyze and understand, where are these terms coming from? Where does this ideology come from? How does this thought pattern even play itself out? And how do I get involved or ensure that I'm protecting myself?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I thank you. Any final words for our Black and beautiful family?
Well, I'm really grateful to you for asking me to be part of this conversation. That really means a lot to me. And, I aim to be worthy of the trust, to be worthy of, um, being an ally. To It's just a great honor to me to be invited to be part of this conversation, and I always learn something when I talk to you.
Same here.
Always.
All right, so before we go, Peter, white allyship, does it exist?
I think so.
Come on, man. After all
I mean, I'd like to think it does. I mean, I think it does on an individual basis. I think there are white people and allies across all marginalized communities, people who are committed to doing what it takes to be an ally. I do believe that exists.
Whoop, whoop. You heard it here, guys, for the first time. White allyship does exist, and you can do it in practice. Okay, so we thank you. God bless you. May heaven smile upon you. I love ending in that. It's been a pleasure, and we will see you in the next episode. Peace out.